Good morning, everyone. If you have paid any attention to local news or social media, you have probably realized that something big is happening with public education in Indianapolis. You may have heard talk about property taxes and school funding, and you have probably sensed that a lot of people are very, very passionate and very, very angry. While the details might be new, this is an argument that is literally as old as the city of Indianapolis. After passionate testimony in the legislature and public activism from the likes of Caleb Mills, in 1847, Hoosier voters chose to fund public schools with a property tax referendum of 12.5 cents on every $100 of assessed value. Mills would go on to help found Wabash College, boo, sorry, I'm from DePaul, and serve as the very first superintendent of public instruction for the state. His famous words still grace the auditorium stage at Indiana's oldest public high school, Shortridge, which still operates today as part of Indianapolis Public Schools. A disciplined mind and a cultivated heart are elements of power. It's a beautiful story of society coming together to invest in the future through education by what Mills called a good and efficient system of free schools. But even this chapter of the history of IPS was not without its drama. Within 5 years of its incorporation, the Indiana Supreme Court ruled that tax levies for public schools were unconstitutional and that all of its schools were to be immediately closed, only to reopen a few years later. My name is Ahlgren, and I am here today to share with you the complex and confounding history of the Indianapolis Public Schools. With 20 years of award-winning service in both IPS's most popular and most struggling schools, I have a plethora of institutional knowledge just waiting to spill out. So today I'm going to do my best to explain the past, present, future of public education in approximately 30 minutes. But please know that if I had 2 hours, I could barely scratch the surface of this complexity of this subject matter. But I can work miracles. I'm a middle school math teacher. But please forgive me. I'm going to peek at my notes a ton because there are so many important things that I want to make sure I don't leave out. I have a very special guest up here with me today to make it happen. Ronak is a fellow miracle worker, middle school science teacher at T.C. Howe Middle School. We were blessed to have Ronak join us in IPS this year after a long and distinguished career in local charter schools. When I first met Ronak, I expected that our experiences would differ drastically. Me, the pro-union IPS lifer, and him, the celebrated and opinionated charter school teacher. But the more I got to know him, the more I realized that our experiences were more similar than different, which is why I invited him here today. I will be upfront and say that I'm a pretty vocal charter skeptic for a myriad of reasons. But at the same time, I know that the majority of the people on the ground who support charters are doing so because they, too, care deeply about the success of the most marginalized students in this city. I believe it's important that we assume best intentions and avoid any sort of public school purity test if we're going to realize Caleb Mills' dream for our state. However, that doesn't mean we can't and don't have strong opinions that we will fight for in the interest of our city's kids. The way we're going to handle our presentation is a little bit of role-playing. I'll be playing the role of the teacher, and Ronak, the part of the curious learner, even though, as I said, he's an expert in everything we will be discussing. So just roll with it as we break down where we are, how we got here, and what happens next. Let's get to it. But as an educator, I also understand that there are times when subject matter experts are the best person to tell the story for my class, and I lean on them for the right guidance. And so I would like to welcome, for our guest speaker this morning, our city's resident historian and premier walking tour guide, Professor Samson Levingston, to walk you through some of our city's history with public education.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Not quite the reception I get at the Indianapolis Symphony Orchestra from the kiddos, but I'll take it. But yeah, I got 2 minutes. I'm going to try to talk to you about how we got here. Okay, so Mary Alice Rand was the first black IPS grad. This is in the 1870s. But also realize there's not that many black people in Indianapolis. So educating or even seeking access to education. So it's not really too big of a deal. There's Abraham Shortridge. He was a good guy. But now let's take a look at how we got here. Because now there's black people here. Look at down at the bottom. I had to update the map. I'm like, I don't know if is this shit accurate? But talking about the Great Migration, right? 1920s, 30s, all these black people start rushing into the city of Indianapolis. And now it's an issue. Because how are we going to educate all these black people? Because we don't really want them in the way of our schools. We set up school systems as white Americans for us. And now all these black people are here. That wasn't really quite part of the plan. So what they do, they opened an all-black high school, 1927, Crispus Attucks, all right, to deal with this rush of African Americans coming into town. Now here's a map from 10 years later that shows how they were devaluing black property. Every time you see this like star, that's Monument Circle, okay, to kind of help show where we're at. But everywhere in the red that's near downtown, you weren't able to get a loan to purchase a home, to build your home, to improve your home, and the property value there starts to go down. And think about how property value funds our schools, okay? We can go forward a little bit more because this is 1946. This is all available online, Google search. Distribution of Negroes in Indianapolis, 1946. This is where we live. Think about where the black schools are. In fact, we had a great lawyer named Henry Richardson try to prove to the state of Indiana that our schools are segregated mainly based off the neighborhoods, because he put this map together. Where the white dots where the red dots were black schools, and the green, these are flipped on here, okay? I messed up. But that's okay. The green dots are black schools, all right? You see Attucks right there, Lockfield Gardens. The red dots are white schools. It looks just like that map of 1946. It looks just like that map from 1937. It's not hard to figure out where the black people are living and where the black people are going to school. But Henry Richardson, he had an idea. We need to integrate our schools. This is before Brown versus Board of Education. He's saying our schools are very segregated because of the neighborhoods. But nothing happens. Nothing happens at all. And IPS remains pretty segregated. And I want to explain the townships for you, because this may be something that's confusing to some people. We got 9 townships here in Indianapolis. You got Pike, Washington, Lawrence, the north, Wayne, Center, Warren, Decatur, Perry, Franklin. All right? And so if IPS started integrating just a little bit, and you didn't really want to go to school with black kids, or you weren't quite sure, or your parents weren't quite sure of which school would fit for you, you can go to the townships. And those look a little bit more white. And there's nothing that they can really do to help integrate those, because it's not all one city yet. It's just the county. But then, boom, Unigov, right? The whole city is the county. So if you ran out to the townships to try to avoid black people, that's about to change here in just a second, because now the whole city is the county. And the Supreme Court rules that you have got to start integrating these schools. And mandatory busing takes place, 1973, right after Unigov, because it's one city, right? So let's have integrated city schools. There were schools that were protesting the busing. And I grew up in Lawrence Township. Perry, Decatur, Franklin, and Lawrence started protesting the busing that would come to their schools. And so if you wanted to leave, if you wanted to get out of the integrated school system that's here, that's funded by us, you could take off outside the county. This is when you see the booms of places like Carmel. In 1950, before they started spreading out, before we started having the townships and integrating IPS, Carmel had about 1,500 residents. Now they have over 100,000. People started to seek other schools to go to. Originally, the Supreme Court ruled that Carmel had to participate in busing. And Carmel was like, you look at the bottom there. Carmel was like, we didn't have anything to do with Indianapolis segregation. Keep us out of that. And they reversed the decision. So now if you were leery about the integration of schools in Indianapolis, busing kids from downtown to the townships, you could just go up to Hamilton, Hendricks, Johnson. What's the other H county? Hancock, right, thank you. You can go out to the donut counties, and you won't have to worry about that ever again. And instantly you see a boom of those schools and their populations start to go up, simply because they didn't want to go to school with black people. And that's how black history, we're talking about that, influences every single thing in Indianapolis. Because there is not quite too much controversial about the schools and where he went to, and still black people started coming to them. So I'm excited that we're talking about all this shit, so let's go.
Thank you, Professor Livingston.
And read the newspaper. That's how you know stuff.
I want to be clear that if you didn't catch it, that forced busing did not end until 2016. When I was interviewing fresh out of college, I interviewed mainly with IPS, got my job in April as a senior. That was awesome. But I interviewed with a number of townships, and at least one asked me an interview question about how I would deal with those kids from IPS. So this is not ancient history, right? This is very real modern history. So let's get back to our lesson.
So Ms. Ahlgren, like if busing happened for 25 years, how does the district look different now?
Well, it looks a lot different, and it is super complicated. But probably the big place to start is in 2001. So charter schools had been around since about the 1970s, originally designed to help improve struggling schools. But it wasn't until 2001 that Indiana dove into allowing charter schools through legislation in the State House. What started as 11 schools in 2002 is up to 120 across the state today. And the idea was that they could have autonomy and flexibility, but the trade-off was because you have no elected board and you have reduced fiscal reporting, that meant you don't get property tax funds. And Indiana very quickly morphed into the state that got this reputation as being very charter-friendly because of laws that were passed. And with that came one of the most controversial aspects of today's battle: significant investment of outside money to pro-charter laws and candidates. School board races in Indianapolis quickly went from several $100 affairs to $500,000+ monstrosities, with the majority of donations tracing back to out-of-state PACs. IPS then began to diversify its programs in an effort to improve results and to respond to those growing number of charters. So you began to see magnet and choice programs replace neighborhood schools. Some of them had requirements to get in, like Seidner High Ability Academy that opened in 2008. Other ones didn't have particular requirements, but they had increased autonomy and a lottery to get in, like the Center for Inquiry Schools, which have an IB model. Super School 19 had a physical education focus, and Shortridge Law and Public Policy was a magnet school that I worked at and had Nigel as a student. How cool was that? These programs, as popular as they were, created their own multi-tiered system of schools within the district. It's important that when we have this conversation, we own our contributions to creating the disparities that we are now trying to remedy. Then in 2012, there was an unprecedented move by the state. They moved, and sorry, I told Ryan I'm not going to get through this without crying, and I have not told this story in over a decade without crying. The state seized control of 4 schools here in Indianapolis and 1 in Gary. Dubbed turnaround schools, they were given to charter operators. 3 of the 4 here in Indianapolis were given to a for-profit entity out of Florida called Charter Schools USA. The 4th was given to EdPower, which runs the Tinley schools, for them to operate Arlington High School. And despite, it's a really painful part of the history for me. That is how I lost my first teaching job. It's how I lost the community that I wanted to serve for the rest of my career, and how there are students in this room who had me back then, and that's how I was ripped away from them as an educator. Despite millions of extra dollars poured into these schools, this experiment was an abject failure and an embarrassment to the state. After 3 years, EdPower at Arlington saw an 80% drop in enrollment, which meant they couldn't even fiscally continue. And so they walked away. And that's another part of my own personal story, because that's when I joined Arlington High School as a part of the team to help transition it back. On the other hand, Charter Schools USA managed to make it till 2020, but then their charter from the state was not renewed. And despite being a for-profit entity, they claimed that they lost millions of dollars in this deal. So for both of those charter operators who took schools in the city, it was financially devastating for the other schools that they operated. Ironically, that same school that I left in such a heartbreaking way is now a shared part of my own story with you, Ronak, because that was TC Howe. By 2021, after the dismal failures that they had experienced, the state legislature actually abandoned takeover as a strategy altogether. But there's a really key piece of history missing here in the middle, and that is innovation schools. In 2015, the state hadn't given up on takeover yet, and IPS had a number of schools that were still in danger of takeover. So we made a choice that has turned out to be one of the most controversial decisions of the last 50 years. Under the direction of Superintendent Dr. Lewis Farabee and school board members elected with the help of that big PAC money I mentioned earlier, IPS opted to voluntarily turn those school operations over to charter management organizations, maintaining minimal oversight over those schools. Then that program soon expanded, including handing over an A-rated school that the district operated to a charter management organization. These new partnerships were initially meant to be a cost-neutral arrangement for IPS that saved the charters money, but shifting regulations have made that no longer the case. And today's funding fight has the potential to completely blow these agreements apart.
But Ms. Ahlgren, aren't like more schools a good thing? Why would that be bad?
Well, because schools cost money, and that's got its own wild history here in the city of Indianapolis. There have been numerous fiscal and challenges over the last 20 years that have impacted both IPS and all of Marion County, leading to this current funding battle that we're seeing play out so publicly. First of all, we have a declining school-age population in the entire state of Indiana. Money relies on the number of students, and it's a threat that's felt by many schools across the state, including our universities. In 1969, when the baby boomers rolled through, we had a peak enrollment of Indianapolis public schools of 109,000 students and 118 schools. Today, there's only 50,000 school-aged children at all in the IPS boundaries. This has left IPS with aging and surplus infrastructure, but often little benefit to offloading it. For many years, IPS was required to sell any empty buildings to an interested charter operator for only $1 instead of market rate for the property. And then 2008 came, and the recession. State funding took a massive dive for all Hoosier public schools. Dollar for dollar, that money did not recover until 2021-22. And on an inflationary basis, it's still not there. In fact, they've estimated that there's a $1,600 gap annually per student, $48 million a year for a district the size of IPS missing from the budget over where we were in 2009. Another challenge has been a shift in funding and priorities of how we fund public schools. One big change is a shift from what I like to call an equity model to more of an equality model. The additional funds set aside to help school districts with challenges such as poverty and special education needs and limited English proficiency is called the Complexity Index. And the state has been increasingly shifting away from this investment in students with the highest needs. And this has a massive impact on all of our urban schools. IPS has reached up to a $26 million gap annually in SPED and ELL services alone. And on top of all of that, there's been a massive shift toward funding vouchers for private schools. And so initially, it had good intentions, intended as a way for low-income families to access private school options after being failed by their local public school. But now, it's primarily utilized by students who have never even been to a public school. And as the income limits have continued to rise, now the majority of families in the state qualify, which has made the surge in costs insane. This budget alone, over $1 million in public funds, will be allocated to go into the coffers of private educational entities in this state. And all of these changes have led lawmakers to proudly tout historic investments in public education. Sorry, I lied. They tout historic investments in education, while Marion County public schools of all types suffer. And what happens is you have an increasing reliance across the state to fill in funding gaps. And that reliance is on property tax funds and referenda. That's why we've started coming to you so much, asking for money. But we have been blessed here in the city to have the voters repeatedly authorize that money for us to use. Now, long time ago, it was originally used mostly for large-scale construction projects. My favorite improvement of the last 20 years of my career was air conditioning. I don't know if Cassie is in here, but when Cassie Hunter started with me at Howe, we did not have air conditioning. It wasn't until 2010. Imagine an August day on the 3rd floor with 30 stinky 8th graders. But it was major construction projects for renovations, for improvements. But now we often have to ask voters to authorize these additional funds to pay for day-to-day operations like teacher salaries. Now, these are only available to public school districts with elected boards, accountable to the voters. And so this has been risen the tension between IPS and our local charter operators over these funds.
Okay, Ms. Ahlgren, I think I get it. So the district lost lots of kids to suburbs due to white flight and busing. And then as it shrank, the buildings fell into disrepair, they got more expensive to maintain, and transportation did too. Then there was lots of competition from charter schools and private schools, and housing insecurity and income inequality just got worse alongside it. But then the funding to address all of those things shrunk alongside the funding for education. It seems like a mess. What do we do now?
Well, before we get into I think we need to understand kind of where these schools are right now, like all these different types of schools. I'm gonna try to do this very quickly because we could literally spend an hour talking on just the types of schools here in Indianapolis. But overall, we start with private schools. There are voucher schools and no voucher schools. Main difference is, do they take Ahlgren, and how much are the out-of-pocket costs for the families? But for public schools in Indianapolis, there is a confusing web of choices where funds, properties, and services have all become enmeshed and intertwined. We'll start with IPS, your traditional public school district. In 2024, under the Rebuilding Stronger system, IPS moved to what's called an all-choice model. There's a lottery that students enter to attend any school. You can go to any school in IPS with a tiny handful of exceptions. There are 4 zones with transportation provided to the student's school of choice, as long as it's within the correct zone for the residency. But there is at least one school of each model that serves each zone. Now, charter schools are their own entities with their own appointed boards. They have a state authorizer who reviews them for extension, and they have that reduced regulations and more autonomy, but because of their lack of direct accountability, as we said, they don't get those same property tax funds. Now, within the charter schools, we have innovation charter schools. These are the ones that have partnered with IPS. And there's really 2 main types. Some chose to join to receive services and operate more efficiently. Like Heron High School would be a good example. And legislative pressure has led the district to voluntarily share a portion of our property tax referendum funds with these innovation partner schools. We've been doing that for several years. And those services vary by the contract. Sometimes it's licensed special education staff. Sometimes it's transportation or purchasing or food service. And then other Innovation Network schools were originally historically low-performing IPS traditional schools. And over the last decade, IPS has used those innovation partnerships as a way to address chronically failing schools without state intervention. But those are often in buildings owned and maintained by IPS. Now, where are our kids in this system? Well, we look at the school choice trends of folks who have opted out of their traditional school district over the last 7 years. We see that the amount of charter school students has actually held pretty steady. We actually have seen the biggest public school increase in students transferring to nearby traditional public schools. And then we have seen the biggest uptick in vouchers. And again, but that's mainly due to an increase in the income limits, and many of these students have never attended a public school. Now, if we look at Indianapolis, we see that the charter school increases aren't coming from our independent charter schools. They're actually coming mostly from our Innovation Network schools, which were partnered with or were created by IPS, as we've slowly turned our buildings over to them over time. And across all school choice types within the IPS boundaries, 63% of school students attend a traditional IPS school or one of our innovation partners. But the big thing is, folks, simply put, Indianapolis has too many schools. This market is completely oversaturated. Less than half of the school-age population and almost the same number of schools. It's absurd, it's inefficient, and it is hurting children.
Ms. Ahlgren, that's way too many. How do they manage to have the resources that they need? What are they doing?
Well, they don't. We are fighting over these limited resources, right? Almost no one meets their enrollment targets, and it's one of the main reasons for charter closure. We're suing each other in court over buildings. Almost 100% of schools have some sort of teacher vacancies, leading to either larger class sizes or a parade of guest teachers. Billboards and yard signs litter my neighborhood. Targeted ads clutter my social media. And one charter school went so far as to give families a $100 gift card to a local grocery store as a recruitment incentive. All of this is money that could have gone directly into classrooms, directly benefiting children.
So, Ms. Ahlgren, why don't we just stop opening schools until things stabilize?
That's a great question. Now, in my opinion, IPS is doing its part to right size. There have been 2 major restructuring moves over the last decade, and I've been a victim of both of them in my staffing. In 2018, we went down to only 4 remaining high schools out of the original 11. Rebuilding Stronger, which began in 2023, targeted elementary and middle schools, closing 6 buildings and focusing on long-term optimization of facilities. But meanwhile, there's no limit on charters. There are 4 proposed new schools in front of the mayor's charter board right now, whose fiscal plans for the next 10 years rely on recruiting hundreds of students each. Where are they coming from? One of the biggest issues is the number of authorizers in the state. These authorizers are who approve the charter schools to operate. And they collect fees from the student funding for administrative oversight. They don't even have to be in your community, so they don't have to consider your community's needs. We were discussing earlier that we think Tryon University has finally usurped Ball State as the worst perpetrator of that. While there is a narrative of additional accountability for charters because of these authorizers, the reality has been that low-performing charter operators have been able to move around and shop different authorizers as each entity has attempted to hold them accountable. As these funding fights play out, there's been shifts in these incentives for charters and voucher schools. Do you remember what happened in the mid-2000s when charter school funding began to increase in Indianapolis?
Well, I remember I had a friend who taught a school called Andrew Academy, and I learned that it used to be called St. Andrew Academy, but they dropped the Saint so they could get public money.
Now the opposite is true. There's a school in town here called the Genius School, which after being dropped by 2 separate charter authorizers, decided to go and seek voucher funds from the private school authorization of the state, which has very little power to say no, and now they're operating as a private voucher school. And with very few limits, more and more groups have found benefit in opening their own schools, sometimes with academics as an afterthought. Noblesville just opened something called the Premier Soccer Academy, which is an offshoot of their local travel soccer club that focuses on their training during the day.
Wait, so like if I own a factory, I could open a private school where the kids just build parts, and then instead of paying them, I could collect voucher money?
Yeah. And this is not just an IPS problem. It really has incentivized charter infiltration and the expansion of private schools paid for with public funds. And so it's to the point where all districts are starting to get worried about what their education landscape will look like. And the reality is that this overabundance is a fiscal nightmare for taxpayers. The inefficiency of running this multi-tiered system of public schools is wasting millions of dollars that could be going directly to help children. Proposed legislation to share property tax dollars would further splinter these funds. And to be clear, this is the exact opposite of what the state has encouraged for rural schools. The state has continually attempted to force mergers as the Indiana Chamber of Commerce considers these small entities wasteful. Why does splintering the funds among so many entities reduce their impact?
Well, it's like when I throw a pizza party for my students, but it's with my teacher's salary, so I just cut it into really small slices. I'm like, here's your pizza.
And nobody feels full.
Works every time.
At the end of the day, I want to be clear. There are students who are thriving, and there are students who are struggling at every single school type. However, there is no student in this city who is getting everything they deserve. Now, the biggest challenge moving forward is there's no playbook for where we are. We are in completely uncharted territory. We are the only consolidated city of our size with multiple districts, let alone 11. Indiana's charter and private school-friendly laws have created a unique educational landscape unseen anywhere else, and that's not necessarily a good thing. There are just a few places for us to look, but nothing is exactly like we are. Arizona's ahead on vouchers, but now they have a completely blown state budget, which is negatively impacting every single operation. And guess what? They've seen a steep rise in tuition costs. keeping those same private schools out of reach for the families they were intended to serve. New Orleans has a higher percentage of charter schools. Do you know what happened in New Orleans, Ronak?
I know they charterized them after Hurricane Katrina, and then they got sued a bunch because they didn't have a district anymore to handle all of the stuff. So then they made a district to handle all the stuff.
There are no easy answers, folks, despite the narratives that get pushed by those with a vested interest. We as a community need to come together to figure out how we're going to navigate this future. And all of Indianapolis should be invested in this fight because the future of our city depends on the success of our public schools. Public education has been shown to have a direct impact on the quality of life of neighborhoods, cities, and states. Economic and development and property values rely so much on it. Businesses look at school quality before they decide to expand their headquarters. There are neighborhoods right here in Indianapolis who have gentrified around public school options that have expanded into their neighborhoods. And from a civic engagement standpoint, educated adults are more likely to vote, volunteer, and participate in community groups. And I know that that's something this audience really appreciates. For our city to thrive, we need all children in Indianapolis to have access to a fully funded public education, not a pile of leftover scraps. I am not naive. I understand that emerging from this current mess will most likely require some level of uncomfortable change. But the long-term success of Indianapolis public schools is vital to the families of the city, and it cannot be allowed to fall victim to death by 1,000 cuts. And as the primary economic driver of this state, Indiana also depends on us getting this right.
Well, so I get the problem and I get the why, and because I'm a student and I know when the bell's about to ring, I know it's 9:54.
Yeah.
So I just want to know, like, if everyone knows it's a problem, what's the state doing to solve it?
Yeah, throwing a bee's nest into it. So I'm here today because there's some immediate threats in the public legislature. I'm going to try to go through them as fast as physically possible. Number one, state budget. There is a move to remove the income limit on vouchers. And that means a significant increase in the state education budget that primarily goes to wealthy families who are already paying for a private school. $1.3 billion in this budget. Property taxes, Senate Bill 1. The governor proposed $2 billion in property tax cuts for our local entities. 20 million of those would have been in IPS. That pays for transportation, debt service, technology infrastructure, facilities. Now, luckily, that also hurt things like police. And so there were changes made at the Senate before it made its way forward, but it's still highly problematic, and Braun does not like it. He's even been running attack ads against his fellow Republicans who changed his bill. So it is very likely that it might come back in its full force. And then Senate Bill 518, which has caused the complete firestorm here in Indianapolis because of its massive repercussions. 518 forces districts to split with all of the charter entities in its boundaries, despite the reductions already coming from Senate Bill 1. At the committee hearing, Superintendent Dr. Lisa Johnson testified that this would require IPS to close 20 to 25 additional schools, all while there is no limit on new charter schools opening and splintering those funds even further. Now, there was a 5-year phase-in changed as an amendment, but it's still a disaster. There's a narrative that this helps provide equity for charters and students who really do deserve a quality education. I want to be clear about that. But in reality, Senate Bill 518, along with several other bills proposed in this session, are really an attempt to legislatively intimidate IPS into voluntarily sharing these property tax funds with all the local charter schools to meet their funding needs when there are other ways that this could be done. There is a line item specifically in the state budget for charter school grants. It could be done instantly, increase the grant. But in fact, their plan is the exact opposite. Senate Bill 518 replaces those grant funds with the shared property tax dollars, meaning the actual impact for each charter school is minimal. If IPS is providing them $1,600 and they were going to get $1,400, only $200 of that is extra money. So you decimate IPS with very little impact on the actual students it's theoretically meant to help. And we could pretend that the state doesn't have funds, but I just told you there's $200 million increase for universal vouchers in this budget. The money's there, it's just being used for private entities with no oversight and the right to discriminate. We are asking to take one group of funds from one group of marginalized kids and give it to another. Public school advocates are rightfully angry about this manipulation, but the propaganda and vitriol has reached a fever pitch, causing rifts in the city council, confrontations at school board meetings, and dueling op-eds across the media. For the first time in 20 years last night, I had to go through a metal detector to go to the school board meeting. Instead of helping the children of Indianapolis, Senate Bill 518 has caused harmful chaos, confusion, and conflict in the community.
Okay, Ms. Ahlgren, you've convinced me, and I'm going to flip my page to the next question that I have and ask you, what can we do about it?
Well, first of all, you can pay attention to what's going on. Make sure that you are staying informed and that you're aware of the sources of information. Like in all politics, there's a lot of misleading and emotionally charged rhetoric and overt manipulation of facts and figures. Pay attention to who stands to benefit from any of those proposed solutions. Then contact your legislature. Start with your House member, because that's where all these Senate bills are about to go. We have a document that we're going to share with you to your email after this event that has links to the two bills that we talked about, and you can reach out to the authors, to the sponsors, and the committee members of where they're about to go. And even better, today after the event, you can speak with one of the fabulous collection of community advocates who will be in the lobby to help you find ways to get engaged with what you learned today. Okay, we're going to wrap things up. And we're going to break character here, and we're both going to deliver brief closing statements and then take some of your questions. Again, make sure you text up the number up there to submit a question.
It's also live? No, it's not. Okay, this one. It is? Oh, hi. Okay, cool. This is fun. Here, I'll give you this.
I'm just a weird height.
Hi, Ronak again. Most of the time when I hear about the charter versus public debate, people highlight differences. Their governance, how they're funded, union membership, and it's all important and it needs to be discussed. But I've taught at an independent charter, at an innovation school, and a traditional district school, and what strikes me is how similar they often are. Many of the students I've taught, and often their families, don't even know that they're at a charter school. So if someone thinks charters are unequivocally superior, and I ask them why, how do they explain it? I usually hear two answers. One, I hear charters have flexibility. My district school honestly feels just as bendy and squishy as the innovation school I taught at before. At both, I had autonomy in my classroom to engage students and drive learning, and I got feedback and directives from higher up to steer me towards their common vision, especially if it relates to state testing. In conversations with other teachers, it doesn't seem like my experience is much of an outlier. Effective charter schools, like district schools, are rigid about some things and flexible about others. And ineffective schools aren't flexible, they're usually just disorganized. I also hear that charter schools have innovative models. School models exist with or without a charter. They have for centuries. You can find extremely unique schools in any type, as well as ones that just feel like any old neighborhood school. At the independent charter I worked at first, it's closed now, the only instructional model was packets. The innovation was consequences. You get a 10-day suspension for cursing, a 2-hour detention if you forgot your homework with no bus service. You could trade a day of suspension for a paddle to the rear. That is not a joke. Schools are all different from each other because 99% of it has to do with the people who are in them, the students and teachers. So it's not surprising that data on charters is really just a mixed bag. But replacing a district with charter schools, getting caught in the endless open-close cycle, that is massively costly and it's destabilizing. It assumes the brand and the board are what make a school great instead of the people in it, and that flies in the face of everything we know. The only thing unequivocal is that great schools are made by great teachers and school leaders, and I know hundreds of wonderful educators that work in every type of school and thousands of incredible students who are taught by them. People who choose to work in public education have something about them that I just deeply love. But the real problem is we just don't have enough of them. We're demolishing the environment that would attract and develop them, and we're pushing out the amazing ones we have. Every year I've taught, the number of vacant classrooms has grown, and I think I'm pushing this. It's fascinating. And a zombified and fractured school system is just not what the students of Indianapolis deserve. We've got to stop the bleeding. We can't do that when everyone's competing for the same staff, when roads are littered with billboards and yard signs pandering for the same shrinking number of students. I think most people don't want to destroy our public school system, but isn't that the obvious consequence of what we're doing? I can think of only 3 ways to prevent more harm, and I can't speak for everyone, but across school types, people I've talked to agree on this. First, we need a moratorium on new charters so things can stabilize. Second, we need to cut off authorizers with no roots or stakes in our city. And third, until funding gets back to pre-recession inflated levels, we shouldn't be cutting or flatlining any parts of a public school's budget.
Do you see why I invited him here today?
Well.
Education is a public good, not a private business, and treating it as such and expecting public schools to simply tighten their belts, in the words of Governor Braun, after years of being starved for funding is reprehensible. Our multi-tiered public education system is unsustainable, and long-term fiscal solutions are necessary for all parties involved. Something IPS Superintendent Dr. Alicia Johnson said during her testimony in opposition to Senate Bill 518 has really stuck with me, particularly after I heard it repeated by the brilliant Senator Andrea Hunley, echoing it back in her response. We should be approaching this problem from a perspective of abundance. The money exists in this state and in this city to fully fund public education. We just continue to make choices that create a false environment of scarcity. Further dividing the resources and hostile legislation only exacerbates this issue and drives a wedge in our community that I believe is probably visible to all of you by this point. Voters have repeatedly chosen to support IPS through ballot referenda. Tens of thousands of families continue to choose IPS every day, especially those students with the highest needs. And the energy around finding a solution to our city's public education challenges has reached an all-time high. But that solution will need to come from collaboration and community action, not chaos and coercion. Thank you.